talking about buyer agency. At this point, you watched the introductory to seller buyer agency to selling properties, right? And we're going to delve a bit more into buyer agency. I want to remind you, this is by no means a one-watch video and you're an expert. This is an introduction. This is a full overview, but it is an overview. So please make sure that you continue your training. There's so much to learn in buying and selling real estate, so many places to focus. This couldn't possibly encompass everything in a 1 hour video, but hopefully we'll give you enough to get your feet wet, to start getting involved, to start going out and finding buyers and starting to get involved with sales. So obviously the first step is you need buyers if you're going to sell them something. So you need to farm for buyers. Your sphere of influence, neighbors, friends, family, past buyers and renters. It's a great place to start. Look at all those lovely people that are ready to buy a place from you. Your past buyers and renters, again, buyers, yes, they bought from you. They may need to upgrade. They may need to downgrade. They may want to move to a new school system, bigger place. Who knows? Buyers who've closed with you previously, they're potential buyers in the future. Also, they're probably going to sell the place they own when they go to buy. So could be a 2-for-1. Renters, clearly we work with a lot of young professionals and grad students, people who are going to be financially very stable and strong, have a great opportunity to become buyers in the future. But you need to be farming. You can also, one way I found very helpful, actually one of the first sales I ever did, was to advertise for larger developments. Some current developments under production are the Pier 4 residences or the Four Seasons private residences. Now, you got to be careful when you advertise that you always represent yourself as a buyer agent. You're advertising buyer agent services. However, in these larger developments, they're usually not too worried about whether or not you're bringing people. They want to cooperate. They've got a lot of units to sell. So they're usually okay with that. Ask them. Make sure in your advertisement you give listing credit, right? 2 beds at, an example of that ad might be 2 beds at Pier 4 starting at the $1.4 million price point. Buyer agency offered by or representing buyers, something of that nature. And then at the bottom, just say courtesy of MLS, so forth, their PIN number or their ID number. Since we're not representing a specific unit, but more the development, there's a little more leeway there. And again, if you're not sure, you can always ask, but I've never found it to be an issue. Where as long as we market ourselves as buyer services for that development, it's a great way to be able to put ads up. You cannot put those ads in MLS. You cannot put them in Zillow or Trulia or anything like that. Craigslist is a kind of a unique place to put them, maybe HotPads or something of that nature, but nowhere where exclusivity is required. With Zillow, with MLS, with Trulia, exclusive relationships are required to market property, which as the buyer agent, you don't have and you can't represent. Other ways of farming for buyers. Mailers, property mailers, market yourself to tenants and home buyers. Send a blast out to a rental building, Waterside Place, Flats on D, whatever some of these more affluent and young and millennial focused buildings. There's potential buyers there. They're a great place to send postcards and flyers out to. Some ideas might be, is it time to upgrade? Do you have a growing family and need more space? Is it time to downsize? Are you an empty nester and you just don't need the 5,000 square foot house anymore? For all you suburban folks out there, this is a great place to market. Get people who want to come into the city and have where there's more action. They don't need 5,000 square feet. 2,000 might be nicer. They want to be near the symphony or the theater or whatever it is. Downsizing, it's a great market. By the way, the number one market. Baby boomers are the largest segment of buyers and sellers, and they hold most of the wealth. Great place to market to. By the way, one thing I like, winter's a great time. There's less buyer competition. So if you're marketing in the winter, it's a great opportunity to kind of remind people, hey, this is a good time to start. There's less competition, less buyers out there. If you've been having trouble buying in the spring or fall, the winter might be your time to make a deal. Farming for buyers. Host open houses for other listing agents, right? Open houses by nature are places where buyers are coming. And believe it or not, a lot of buyers come in unrepresented. They are potential buyers that you could represent. Now, at the open house, you have to remember you represent the seller for that property. By default, by definition, there's no other way to say it. If someone walks into that property and wants to buy the property at the open house, you are representing the seller. Unless you have a pre-existing relationship, we talk about that in agency already. We'll cover it again in a little bit. However, most of the time you're getting new potential buyers. If they're not going to buy the place that they walked into that you're hosting the open house for, they become buyer customers for other properties. You can go attend open houses, be careful about how you approach this, but you need to know, you do need to go to attend open houses just to know what else is out there and preview properties, to get familiar with buildings and so forth, their common areas, the layouts, what the utility situations are like. It also gives you a good example of how many people are attending different open houses, what the market reaction has been to those open houses. You know, if you go and you see 100 people there and the property is still available the next week, there's probably an issue with the pricing. Most people are agreeing, and that might be an opportunity for your buyers, if you were to bring a buyer, to get a little bit of a deal. There's a lot of things that could signify, but it gives you some good feedback. But as a buyer's agent, you constantly need to be previewing and going to open houses. Going to open houses also helps you meet listing agents. A lot of listing agents host open houses, especially the broker open houses that typically occur on Wednesday, Thursdays, and Fridays. And as you get to know the listing agents, when you bring your buyers in, they're going to put a face to you, and they're going to, hopefully want to work with you. And there is influence in that. I've done deals through my relationships with other realtors where they could tell the seller, hey, Jason will have a buyer that closes. He's got a great deal. The buyer's strong. And Jason's easy to work with. He knows what he's doing. We've got a closing deal here. Two deals being the same, it's certainly fine for the seller to say, I'm more comfortable and I think this is a more professional agent, which bodes well for you. Doesn't mean you're going to get the deal, but it's certainly a mark in your column, right? Qualifying buyers. Now remember, this is a lot like qualifying renters. We need to identify their behavioral style, just like with a renter, so we know how to work with them. We need to know, are they ready and able? And we need to understand their motivations, like qualifying her with a rental. When do they need to buy? When do they need to take occupancy by? When is there some trigger that's important for them? Are they waiting for a job offer? Are they waiting for funds to become available from the proceeds of a sale? Do they need to sell their house before they can buy a new place, or can they buy a new place and then sell their house? If they're upgrading, if they're on a lease, are they okay buying before the end of the lease? There's a lot of considerations there. Discuss the buying process up front, and that'll also help you qualify the buyers further. It's complicated and can be frustrating, especially in a multiple offer situation, which means a high demand market where lots of offers are coming in. So they need to understand what the market conditions are like, and they need to know, are the properties priced to create a bidding war or to generate offers? That's where your market analysis, your comparative market analysis, your feel and pulse for the market. By going to those open houses, you start to know more and more what's a good deal and what's not a good deal. And sometimes with the not a good deal, they're a little more negotiable. They went for the top so they can negotiate down. Sometimes you see a place that comes on, it's so under market value, you wonder what's going on. Well, they're fishing for a bidding war. Don't be afraid to apply DISC, by the way. What type of personality style are they? If they're decisive, deep, or C personalities, they see what they want. They may just want to be competitive and get it. That's called an emotional buyer. Maybe if they're an I buyer, they've made an emotional connection as well. C buyers, it's got to be price. It's got to be value, right? They need to know they're getting the right deal. It's not just about an emotional connection. Be careful not to scare buyers away when you describe this. I've learned this the hard way many times. You've got to be gentle, but be realistic. It doesn't do any good not to tell people what they want to hear. However, it also doesn't do any good to scare them right out of the market. You've got to be realistic, but be careful with how you approach it. Exclusive agreements for buyer to represent a buyer with consent to dual agency. Now, we know that the Massachusetts Mandatory Licensee Consumer Relationship Disclosure, or the MMLCRD, as I like to say, and you will get that good at saying it one day, I promise you. That is your first fundamental thing. When you meet that buyer the first time, if you recall, you can start as a facilitator. And if they decide they want to hire you as a buyer agent, you should have them sign up as a buyer agent, so you can move from facilitator to buyer agent. Remember, you can't move from buyer agent to facilitator. However, if you are going to become their buyer agent, get them to sign an exclusive agreement. There's benefit for both people. It's crazy to me how our marketplace doesn't use these more. We should set the standard. Many people coming to Boston are from markets where buyer agency is the norm. It's the expectation, exclusive buyer agency, excuse me. But basically what it does is it's guaranteeing you, if they buy a property in the area that we've defined in the agreement, then a commission's owed to you. The amount of that commission is set in the agreement. If it's 2.5%, 2%, 3%, typically in our office, we charge 2.5%. There is some negotiating that can be done as long as you cannot, discuss that negotiating with me in advance, but it sets that commission. That means let's say MLS, the amount of the commission being offered is 2%. Well, we've already got an agreement that 2.5% is being paid by the buyer. The seller will cover the first 2%. The buyer will be responsible for the other 0.5%. Keep in mind, it's perfectly fine for the buyer to ask the seller to cover that difference for them in the offer. It's another contingency we can add as buyer agents. We cannot ask the listing agent to provide that to us, but the buyer can ask the seller in the offer. Why is it so important? Because if you run around with a buyer, and I've made this mistake, I still make this mistake, I get caught up, it's a great referral. I start running out the door with them, and it always bites me in the butt. They go in, you take them out for 2 months, you look at properties, maybe you meet 4 or 5 times. They call you 2 weeks later, they went to an open house, they fell in love with the place, they worked directly with the listing agent, they bought it. Big no-no, big mistake. It gets me upset just thinking about it. Hopefully it gets you upset, and it's a great reason why you shouldn't be working without the safety net of the exclusive agreement. What's more important from the buyer's perspective, they have someone who's agreeing to put effort into helping them find property. You can go on, you will help them find off-market property. You will provide the service of evaluating and finding on-market property. You will help them negotiate so they get a better deal in most cases. There's really no deterrent under current market conditions. The seller is offering to pay the buyer agent. There is an obligation for the seller to offer compensation to the buyer as part of MLS's regulations. So there's already that offer and compensation being made, including if there is a difference between what the buyer is being charged and what the seller's offering. Well, the buyer can certainly ask the seller to cover it. One thing I didn't mention is if it exceeds, for example, if we are charging the buyer 2.5% and the seller's offering 3%, well, that's a kickback. That extra 0.5%, the 3% minus our 2.5% fee, that's something the buyer actually benefits from. So it can be a bonus to the buyer. So continuing the qualifying the buyers, the buyer presentation, making sure they're able to buy means getting pre-qualifications if they're going to be getting a mortgage. These are essential for presenting offers and making sure you have real buyers. It isn't even worth talking about properties until you have them pre-qualified. If they're not cash buyers, they need to get pre-qualified in advance. There's a second level called the pre-approval, which makes them an even stronger buyer in the eyes of the seller. It positions them to be a better buyer. But from our perspective, we want to know they have a legitimate, we need to know what their budget is legitimately. And the banks are going to help us determine that. That's what they're for, to help the buyer understand their buying power and give us a price point we can work with. So crucial. I see so many new agents want to run out the door. It doesn't take much time to get this done. 24 hours, you can have it. Sometimes even quicker than that. If you bring buyers, by the way, who do not close, in other words, you get the offer accepted and they don't close, you may get that reputation with listing agents of not being a reliable buyer agent and not bringing realistic buyers. Get that pre-qualification so you know that they're realistic and this is one of those fundamental things. All right, researching properties. Learn to perform inclusive searches without providing too much data into MLS. In other words, you want to be the filter. You don't want to limit yourself. I had a conversation earlier today with someone about searching for condos, but only having townhomes show up. I had to remind them, if I do that and the agent listing the condo that's a townhome doesn't identify the style as townhome, then it won't come up in their search and they won't get that result. So we need to learn to perform inclusive searches. Includes as much data that's reasonable and get that information out. Make sure you add that buyer to an MLS search and create those searches as soon as you get off the phone with that buyer or as soon as you have that first meeting. These things have a way of not happening and you end up missing the opportunity to work with them. Follow through is crucial. So get that buyer set up in MLS. If you have a Real Scout account, get them set up in Real Scout. Real Scout's a great tool we utilize. I think it's a better system for helping buyers find property than MLS. It certainly has its advantages. It's got all the same data. It's uploaded or it's updated just as often. So make sure you're getting them set up at the very least in an MLS search. Also remember, when you're doing searches, we talked about inclusive searches, do not include neighborhoods. Use zip code, okay, or city names. Be careful when adding areas by neighborhood because not all agents remember to put the neighborhood in. They put the zip code, they put the town or city, but they don't put the neighborhood. And then when you do that neighborhood search, it doesn't one come up. I always search by zip code. I may use 2 or 3 zip codes if a neighborhood straddles those zip codes, and then omit the ones that I know aren't in those zip codes or aren't in the areas of those zip codes that aren't in that neighborhood. A good example, Chestnut Hill, that straddles 2 different zip codes. So make sure you're using the Newton, actually 3 different zip codes. Make sure you're using the Newton, the Boston, and the Brookline zip codes so you get the full coverage. If you just do Chestnut Hill, you may not get the results you think you're going to get. So sending buyers to open houses, that's okay. You can create a showing sheet through MLS for them. I believe you can also do that through Real Scout. You can provide them the open house dates and times and addresses. You don't want to necessarily include the agent who's hosting the open house's contact info. Make sure that you take off the listing office information. You can just uncheck that from MLS and then have them call you if there's an issue with the open house. You want to be the main conduit for communication, right? I'd also suggest contact the open house agent and let them know your customers are coming. Create that connection. It's a great courtesy. It's a great way to build trust in a relationship, but you should make those listing agents aware, hey, I've got some customers that are planning on coming by. I just want to give you a heads up, and they're planning on being there at 1 o'clock. So hope it goes well. That heads up will be appreciated by the listing agent. They'll know to keep an eye out for it. And in our business, there's cooperation there. You do not need to go to an open house to be the buyer's agent. Now, if you sign that exclusivity agreement that we've talked about and stressed, you'll be safe no matter what. However, if you send a buyer to an open house and the listing agent tries to strong arm you, see me, you don't need to be there to be due a compensation for a procuring cause claim. A little off track here, but I want to throw that in there. There is no requirement, whether or not it's stated in MLS. The listing agent cannot require you to go to the open house. Give the list agent a courtesy notice. We just talked about that. Speaking ahead of my time, some MLS agents try and require you to attend, but that is against MLS and policies and not enforceable. Scheduling showings. A lot of times this does take 24 hours notice or more. Again, the seller's agent has to contact the seller and set up the appointment. There's a bit of a time frame to get this done. So scheduling showings, you want to try and give yourself 24 hours notice. Doesn't always take that. Sometimes properties are on lockboxes and get them in there more quickly than that. Make sure the MMLCRD, the Massachusetts Mandatory Licensee Consumer Relationship Disclosure, is signed before you tour the property. Remember, at the first face-to-face meeting where specific property is discussed is when this form is due. If you're representing them as a buyer agent at this point, you should be having them sign it that you are the buyer agent, and they understand that. Hopefully you've had a meeting with them. You've already signed the exclusive buyer agency agreement. This is a non-issue. Make sure you bring a listing printout for your buyer, either through MLS or website. Real Scout, there's plenty of ways to get that information, but you want to make sure you're bringing that with you. If you're showing multiple properties, it's nice to prepare a package. We have professional folders for you to use. Use them. There's all sorts of great information we try and stuff in there as well. And it creates a nice presentation. It elevates our level of professionalism in the consumer's eyes, gives them a place to store things. You can print with photos so they have something to refer back to, even if they're in black and white. We don't have color printers in the office, but that's okay. Black and white photos are fine. It just gives them a frame of reference. Their memory will fill in the colors. Pairing offers. Okay, so they found something they like and they want you to help them negotiate and find a price. That's where we came to shine, right? Do an RVN realtor valuation model and a comparative marketing analysis on the property. These are found through NAR RPR, a free member benefit as a realtor. You should have access and be familiar with that. Plenty of training videos available through RPR. So if you're not sure how to do it, just log in, go to their help desk, their help site, and watch the videos. But very quick, takes about 15 to 20 minutes to create these reports. That'll help you determine what the fair value is. However, there may be other factors. Remember, home buying is not just an investment. If you're working with an investor, it could be very black and white. Does it make sense? However, if you're working with a home buyer, there's an emotional attachment that buyers may have, and they may be okay overpaying. You need to have these discussions with your buyer. Overpaying might mean all sorts of different things. Remember, we talked about some listings may be priced at a point that they are expecting multiple offers and trying to create a bidding war. Overpaying does not mean over asking price. Very important to understand that. Very important to have set that expectation with your customer up front. Offers are not price only. This is very important. if you're negotiating, if you're bringing an offer to a multiple offer situation, especially, the price they're paying may not be the only factor. The strength, the timeliness, the contingencies in the financing, how quick are they moving to the purchase and sale? How quickly are they closing? What are the contingencies being asked of? And for the buyer's protection, home inspections, lead paint inspections, pest inspections, radon inspections. If you've got a strong price, but every contingency in the book thrown in, that may not be as good as a price that's $10,000 or $20,000 less, but has no contingency attached to it, right? So contingencies can hurt deals. I like to think of every contingency I add is probably decreasing the value of my offer. Depending on the contingency, it can directly affect the value it decreases the offer. Financing is a really important one because the amount the person's paying towards the house out of pocket, in other words, the lower the loan to value ratio is of the amount of money they're borrowing versus the value of the home, the stronger the offer. So if they're paying for it 100% out of pocket, that's a very strong offer. We call that a cash buyer. However, if someone's borrowing 80%, putting 20% down, still typically considered a pretty strong buyer. If they're putting less than 20% down, borrowing more than 80% of the value of the home, well, that might not be as strong of a buyer, and a cash buyer or a stronger, someone who's putting more money into the deal will probably be preferred and might get the property for less money. Price is not the only issue. Buyers may need to sacrifice contingencies in a tight market to get the price they want, so be aware of that. They also need to be able to make a decision quickly. Present the offer to the seller, include a cover page. I really like cover pages. I prefer to present the offer if I'm able to, but a lot of times listing agents are either not trained in allowing us to do that or the logistics of it make it difficult. Oftentimes the sellers don't want to meet us. They hired an agent to have an agent. They don't want to work with the buyer's agent as well. So a cover letter is a great way to include this. A lot of times I work with the buyers to put this together. Some things I like to remind them. If they have an ethnic sounding name, you may not want to include it. We don't want to create a situation where the seller might feel like it's a potential discrimination issue. Photos can be difficult because we don't want to have them, again, put the seller in a position where they feel they're in a discrimination issue. But a nice write-up like this is going to be our family home. We're looking at raising our kids here. We love the house. If you're connecting with a seller who raised a family there, they might really appreciate that. The style, their upbringing, there are ways to connect. Again, these are not just black and white dollar amount transactions. There are people behind them. We have to remember there are people behind them, and we can appeal to those emotions. MLS regulations, by the way, state the agent has a right to be present during the offer presentation unless the seller given written instructions to the contrary. That can just simply mean an email, by the way. However, like I said, I'm more interested in presenting the buyer in the best possible light. So between something that the buyer puts together for the seller to review and maybe something I write up about them, and the more established you are as a buyer's agent, the more credibility you're going to get in that letter from the listing agent who's going to be presenting this to the seller. And that comes with time and exposure and networking, getting out in the realtor community. The stronger those offers are going to be. Again, I've specifically had situations where I brought a very strong offer, cash buyer, over asking. It was by no means a meager deal. We hit it on those levels, and it was a relationship I had through the realtor organization with the listing agent. They knew I was a competent agent. They knew my buyer was legitimate. We put a nice package together. The property was put under agreement before anyone else had a chance to see it. We got the first showing. We got the first deal. Those relationships matter, and how you present those offers matter. Present the offer to the seller, include a cover page. Great. If you cannot present, I think I've stressed that enough. In the package, so what does the package look like? Well, certainly if they're getting financing, include the pre-qualification or the pre-approval. Make sure it's from a reputable bank, not to name names, but there are certain national banks that include the word America in them that we tend not to find as reliable as other pre-qualifications. Most listing agents want to see a known commodity, like a bank that they're familiar with, as part of the pre-qual. While the seller cannot require the buyer to use any specific bank, they can determine whether or not they're going to accept the pre-qualification as valid. Doesn't mean that they have to use the bank they get pre-qualified with, but they do want to be pre-qualified with a well-known bank that the seller's agent will trust. There's plenty of them out to choose from, and we're more than happy to provide you with the list. Proof of funds, if they're not going to be getting financing, a letter from the bank saying that the buyer has funds in excess of the purchase price, a statement from their bank of savings, that could be an option as well. I remember that would be personal information. You want to be careful with how you handle those statements, right? A lead paint notification certification, that's something the seller should have signed and included in MLS. The seller's agent should be available for download there. If it's not, call the listing agent and ask for it. If it's not there and they won't provide it or won't respond to you, see me. We have to discuss how we handle that situation because quite frankly, there isn't a good one. The seller is required to do this before they list the property if the property is built before 1978. Of course, the Massachusetts mandatory licensing consumer relationship disclosure, everyone wants to see that we followed that. We do not need to send them our exclusive agency agreement. We do need to send them a copy of the MMLCRD. Any other documentation which might be helpful, like the cover letter or anything else that's being referenced, should also be in there from the buyer's perspective. We want to give the seller a package they can look at and make sure the buyer is capable of following through on the representations that they're making in the purchase offer. We want to convey the earnest money deposit that's due with the offer to the seller agent. In my experience, the seller's agent's going to want that before the seller will sign and accept the offer. They want to be able to deposit that check if they accept the offer, just like a landlord wants to deposit that check if they accept the applicant. Make sure you have a deposit in hand before you present, or you may end up embarrassed if your buyer backs out. This has happened to me on a couple of occasions, not in a long time, because I won't even present an offer. I won't discuss an offer with a seller's agent or a buyer I'm working with unless I have that deposit in hand. I've seen too many situations where buyers make all the right claims, they get their deal accepted, and then all of a sudden it's radio silence. Get that check from them as part of the process up front. Have it made payable to the listing agents, the agent, but the agent's office. If the seller's representing themselves in a FSBO situation, maybe you get the sellers, you make it payable to the seller's attorney. You find out who the seller's using for an escrow agent. Remember, the seller cannot be the escrow agent. Very important you understand that. The seller cannot be the escrow agent. All right, keeping track of contingencies. Make sure you calendar them all, okay? We've covered contingencies previously. You can refer to the introductory video, but you need to make sure you're keeping track of all those contingencies. Provide the buyer with a home inspector handout, which is found in the ZIP forms, Greater Boston Association of Realtors library. But make sure that inspection is scheduled quickly after the acceptance. You want to touch base with attorneys a few days before the purchase and sale is due to be signed. Confirm it's being prepared. If necessary, notify the seller's agent if the draft of the purchase and sale is not the buyer's attorney at least 4 days prior to the signing date. The seller's attorney is going to prepare the purchase and sale. The buyer's attorney is going to review it and amend it, and then they have to agree to it. That takes time. The seller's agent needs to get that documentation together so that the buyer's agent can respond to it. We don't want to wait till the last minute. We want to be the professional, proactive agent in there. So you want to make sure you're staying on top of it, but don't contact the seller's attorney directly unless you're representing the seller. Call the seller's agent and have the seller's agent contact the seller's attorney. Keeping track of contingencies, financing commitment dates, right? Not only the commitment dates, but the application dates are important. Remind the buyer that while they're waiting for the purchase and sale to be signed, they've gotten their home inspection done. If they're doing a home inspection, they've gotten all the other documents. Maybe they need a condo doc review, meeting minutes, and so forth. Give them a warning a couple days ahead of time. Hey, don't forget your application needs to be complete into the bank for your financing. A couple days after the purchase and sale is signed, whatever that date is, purchase and sale is usually part of the application. That is fundamental and required. So it can't be a complete application until the purchase and sale is signed. But they also may need to, the date by which the inspection needs to be done and acknowledged. If they have any reservations about the home inspection or the radon test, whatever other contingencies, though, you need to make sure that they're following those dates. It's our buyer who is in jeopardy if those dates aren't met and no notice termination of the deal or extension to those dates is made, right? Maybe grounds for termination of the contract, but more importantly, maybe a basis where the buyer cannot perform, but has acted outside those dates and is now going to lose money because they haven't met those dates. All right, purchase and sale. Make sure the buyer has read through it and if necessary, review it with their attorney. If necessary, I'd almost say recommend they do it. If they've not bought before, it's best that they do it with the attorney. We are not allowed to give legal advice. We are not attorneys. We cannot interpret this legal document for them. However, we should be reviewing it to make sure our commission is listed correctly, make sure that the address is listed correctly, make sure that their names are listed correctly. We look at these things just as much as those attorneys do, so we should be able to read them and spot problems. I recently found something where a house I was working on was in Boston and was listed in Wellesley. And obviously there's a little problem there. We want to make sure we're transferring the correct property. Same address, but the town was Wellesley instead of Boston. These things happen. The attorneys are working off of boilerplate purchase and sale agreements. We just need to give them a hand to make sure that they didn't miss anything. The mortgage, they must meet the deadlines for completing the application, see the financing contingency, and as we said, the purchase and sale is required as part of the application. So if the purchase and sale is delayed and extended, then that inspection contingency date should be extended. All right, so at this, we've signed the purchase and sale agreement. We've gotten the purchase and sale signed by the buyer. We've given the seller the purchase and sale signed by the buyer. We've given the seller the funds that the buyers owes with that purchase and sale. We call that the escrow deposit. And we've gotten a copy back of that purchase and sale and given the fully executed copy to the buyer. They've met all their contingencies. We're getting ready to close. So preparing for the closing. The seller signs the deed and the HUD, the transfer deed, the HUD, also called nowadays we use a settlement statement, part of the Tilo-Respa Act. The 6D needs to be prepared. This is by the seller's agent, thankfully. Insurance certificate from the seller's agent or the homeowners association. We need to get that. The master policy from the HOA so that the buyer can get an insurance policy for the property, especially when they're getting a mortgage, they need that insurance policy. The smoke inspection or Title V, all of these need to be transferred to the buyer's attorney, who's typically the closing attorney, right? After the seller signs over the deed and the HUD, the buyer's going to take that and sign that at the closing, as long as all these documents are together. We also need commissions. We want to get paid, right? So it's very important that we get the buyer agent W-9 and invoice to the seller's agent in advance. Why? Because the seller's agent is the one who's typically, or the brokerage is going to be paying out the commission from the escrow deposit that they're holding. This is usually how we get paid. A lot of times the seller's agent's holding 5 or 10% in escrow of the purchase price until the closing date. So that 5% to 10% usually covers the commission that we're being paid. So they're just, instead of going to the buyer's attorney or the closing attorney, whoever that might be, they simply pay us, but we have to invoice them for it. The balance, whatever's left after they pay out those commissions, that goes to the attorney as part of the closing proceeds for the seller. Usually the check is delivered with the closing docs to the buyer's attorney as part of the settlement. And just remember that no one can get paid out until the property is on record. So while we may hold the check prior to the actual closing date being on record, so example, if you close, everyone signs Friday at 4, we might not go to record till Monday at 10 o'clock a.m. No one can get paid till that date. We may be holding the checks, but we can't actually deposit it until that time. Make sure the sellers are moved out prior to the closing. How do we do that? Well, before we actually go to close, we're going to do a buyer walkthrough. That typically happens the day before or the day of the actual closing. We're going to make sure that the seller's mail is set to be forwarded. Just let's remind the seller of that, or seller's agent, so that the buyer doesn't end up getting a bunch of mail that doesn't belong to them. We want to make sure that the keys and any access that the buyer needs has been prepared by the seller's agent. Quick email helps out there. And we want to ask that the seller make sure they clean the property, broom swept, basic cleaning for the buyer. We talk about the buyer walkthrough. That's always important. We want to make sure that when we do that walkthrough, anything that was supposed to be included with the sale is there. There's no extra damage to the property that might have been taken place after the property was seen and in the process of the seller moving out. The seller's agent's also should be reminding the seller to disconnect their services and do final water meter or oil tank readings or whatever the case might be. All of that information will be part of the settlement statement. We want to make sure that all the appliances and the fixtures, window treatments, chandeliers, cabinets, all that stuff that's supposed to be there is there. If it's not, we need to account for it as part of the closing, and that's something that has on occasion come up. Usually if you're working with a good seller's agent and the seller's agent's working with the seller correctly, these issues are all avoided, and there's really a smooth transition typically. I want to make sure the buyer's information has been transferred to their contact info has been transferred to the homeowners association. So the homeowners association knows who to contact in case there's any issues. Also, if any buzzers need to be set up or mailboxes or parking space access, whatever it is. And obviously, one way to keep referrals is to give them a nice little closing gift and thank them for their business. We want to build our business off relationships. Closing gifts definitely go a long way in the relationship building. All right, let's talk quickly about bill outs. Bill outs require that you have it scanned into Prospect Converter, the MML-CRD, the listing agreement, or if in the case of a buyer's agent, the exclusive buyer agency agreement, the lead paint transfer or notification certification, if the property was built before 1978, the signed offer and acceptance, the signed purchase and sale, and the HUD or settlement disclosure and any other documents relating to the purchase. So all those are required. You also need to archive all emails between you and the seller or the buyer or the seller's agent and their attorney, as well as any other information relating to the transaction that you may have emails. Archiving through Gmail, pretty straightforward. There's plenty of videos on how to do that. Simply archive it, take that zip, add it to Prospect Converter, you're all set. That's the easiest way to get all those emails out. And then all paper agreements or notes or anything in paper you may have relating to this transaction should be turned into the office. We're going to keep record of all this information. We're going to back up all the digital information you provide and documentation. We're going to take all the paper agreements and file that. This way, if anyone ever challenges or gets into a he said, she said situation 5 years from now, and we're talking about $1 million or $2 million sale, we can protect ourselves against any future liabilities. So that's the basics of buyer agency and getting paid for doing it through the bill out. There's so much more to learn. There's so many resources we've made available to you. This is a great overview. You got to get out there. You got to put yourself in front of people. You got to ask for business. Again, you can't help anyone buy a property if you don't have anybody to work with. So go out there, you find some buyers, market yourself. You've got a basic understanding. You're going to do more training. You're going to watch other videos. You're going to learn more about buyers and getting through transactions. But at some point, you just got to get into the ring and go for it. So I hope this gives you some confidence in doing that and you're able to start working with some buyers. And I look forward to helping you with many sales transactions.